One grenade. Total darkness. 800 screaming voices in the jungle. And one Marine who kept firing after the world went black. The night air on Guadalcanal hung thick and wet, clinging to skin like a second layer of filth. August in the Solomon Islands felt less like a season and more like a punishment. The kind of heat that turned uniforms into sweat-soaked rags and made every breath taste of salt and rot. Private First Class Al Schmid felt it pressing down on him as he crouched behind the Browning M1917 machine gun, his fingers tracing the familiar contours of the weapon in the darkness. The metal was already warm to the touch, absorbing the ambient temperature of the jungle night. In a few hours it would be scalding. They called it the Tenaru River, though that was a mistake on somebody's map. The real name was Ilu, but names didn't matter much to the men dug in along its eastern bank. What mattered was the Sandbar, a natural bridge of packed coral sand stretching across the mouth where the river met the sea. What mattered was the machine gun nest, a shallow depression in the earth reinforced with sandbags and camouflaged with palm fronds. What mattered was that Henderson Field lay behind them, the only operational airstrip in American hands for 1,000 miles in any direction, and if the Japanese wanted it back, they would have to cross that sandbar first. They would have to come through this position, through this gun, through these three men. Schmid glanced left at Corporal Johnny Rivers, the primary gunner, whose hands rested on the weapon's grips with the easy confidence of a man who had fired thousands of rounds in training and hundreds more in anger. Rivers was from Philadelphia, a tough kid from the Navy Yard district who never seemed rattled by anything. Next to him sat Private Lee Diamond, the assistant gunner and ammunition handler, a quiet kid from New York who rarely spoke but never complained. The three of them had been rotating shifts on this position for 2 weeks, watching the jungle across the river, listening to the surf behind them, waiting for something that intelligence said was coming but never quite arrived. Until tonight, the first indication came not as sound but as absence. The jungle insects, those countless chirping, clicking, buzzing creatures that formed the sonic backdrop of every tropical night, went quiet. The silence spread like a wave, a growing pocket of nothingness that made every sense sharpen. Rivers tensed, his fingers tightening on the grips. Diamond reached for an ammunition can without being told. Schmid felt his heartbeat accelerate, that primal response to danger that no amount of training could suppress. Then the whistles began. They came from deep in the tree line across the river, high-pitched and organized, the sound of officers rallying their troops. The Japanese were masters of night operations, trained to move in darkness with a discipline that bordered on fanaticism. They believed in the spiritual power of night attacks, in the shock value of screaming charges, in overwhelming the enemy through sheer audacity and willingness to die. The Marines had heard stories from the veterans of Wake Island and the Philippines, tales of banzai charges that didn't stop until every attacking soldier was dead. Those stories had seemed like exaggerations during the bright safety of afternoon. In the darkness before dawn, they felt like prophecy. Movement erupted across the river. Not the tentative probing of a reconnaissance patrol, but the massive coordinated surge of hundreds of men. The Ichiki detachment, named for its commander Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, had been tasked with recapturing Henderson Field and restoring Japanese control of Guadalcanal. Intelligence estimated 800 soldiers, maybe more, all veterans of campaigns in China and Manchuria, all trained to believe that death in service of the emperor was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. They had landed east of the Marine perimeter days earlier, had spent the intervening time gathering intelligence and preparing for this moment. They had chosen tonight, the darkest hours before dawn on August 21, 1942, to launch their assault. They had chosen this sandbar as their crossing point. They had chosen wrong. The first shapes materialized on the sandbar, dark silhouettes against the slightly lighter backdrop of sky and sea. Rivers opened fire without waiting for orders. The Browning roared to life, its mechanical rhythm drowning out everything else. The weapon fired at a rate of 450 rounds per minute, each round a .30-06 caliber bullet capable of punching through a man at this range and hitting the man behind him. The muzzle flash lit up the scene in stuttering orange bursts, creating a nightmarish tableau of advancing soldiers caught in mid-stride, some falling, others pressing forward, still more emerging from the jungle behind them. Schmid fed the ammunition belt, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The belt fed from the left, draped across his forearms, each round chambered and ejected in a continuous cycle of controlled violence. Spent brass casings rained down to their right, pinging off sandbags and earth, already forming a growing pile of evidence. The gun barrel began to heat up, the metal expanding with each sustained burst. Rivers fired in short, disciplined bursts, 5 to 7 rounds at a time, just as they had been trained. Conservation of ammunition was crucial. Barrel discipline was essential. But the Japanese kept coming. They advanced in waves, not random charges but organized assaults. The first wave hit the killing zone and crumpled under the machine gun fire, soldiers falling into the shallow water of the river mouth or collapsing on the sandbar itself. The second wave came before the first had fully fallen, stepping over bodies, screaming into the darkness. Some carried rifles with fixed bayonets. Others wielded samurai swords, family heirlooms carried into battle with ceremonial reverence. A few held grenades, the distinctive potato masher style of Japanese explosives. All of them kept coming. The sound was overwhelming. The machine gun's mechanical hammering provided a constant bass note. The crack of rifle fire came from Japanese soldiers shooting from the treeline and from Marine positions up and down the perimeter. Grenades detonated with flat, earth-shaking thuds. Men screamed, some in rage, others in pain, the language barrier meaningless in the universal vocabulary of violence. The air filled with the smell of cordite, burnt powder that stung the eyes and coated the throat. Blood and salt water created a distinct metallic tang. The jungle itself seemed to be sweating, releasing the accumulated moisture of the day in a heavy mist that rose from the ground and mingled with gun smoke. Diamond worked like a man possessed, moving ammunition cans into position, preparing each belt, passing water to rivers when the heat became too intense. The Browning consumed ammunition at a terrifying rate. Each can held 250 rounds, and they burned through the first 3 in the opening minutes. The Marines had stockpiled 24 cans at this position, along with spare barrels and repair tools. It had seemed excessive during the afternoon. Now it seemed barely adequate. Rivers adjusted fire constantly, tracking movement across the sandbar, suppressing concentrations of soldiers at the treeline, firing into the shallow water where wounded Japanese soldiers tried to crawl to cover. His face gleamed with sweat, illuminated periodically by muzzle flash. His jaw was set, his eyes focused, his hands steady. He was 20 years old. The Japanese tactics evolved. After the first waves broke against the machine gun fire, they began trying to flank the position. Soldiers waded into the surf, attempting to move around the sandbar and approach from the seaward side. Others tried to crawl through the shallow water of the river itself, using the bodies of fallen comrades as cover. A group attempted a direct frontal assault, running full speed across the sandbar with bayonets fixed, betting that sheer momentum could close the distance before the machine gun cut them down. They lost that bet. Schmid found himself transfixed by the violence unfolding before them. In training, targets were paper silhouettes or wooden frames. They fell when hit and stayed down. They didn't scream. They didn't crawl toward you with intestines trailing. They didn't keep fighting after being shot 3 times. The reality of combat was simultaneously more mundane and more horrific than anything he had imagined. The machine gun was just a tool, a mechanical device that required maintenance and feeding. The men dying in front of it were abstractions, threats to be eliminated, targets to be engaged. But every muzzle flash revealed faces, young faces mostly, twisted in determination or agony or both. Every scream had a human source. Every body represented a family somewhere who would never know the exact moment their son or brother or father stopped existing. The gun jammed. Rivers cursed, hands flying over the weapon in practiced motions. A round had failed to extract fully, the spent casing lodged in the chamber. He pulled the cocking handle, trying to clear it manually. The action was stuck. Diamond was already moving, passing him the cleaning rod. The Japanese sensed the pause in fire and surged forward, their voices rising in anticipation. Schmid grabbed his M1 Garand rifle and began firing single shots at the nearest threats, trying to buy Rivers the seconds he needed. Other machine gun positions up and down the line increased their rate of fire, creating overlapping fields of death. But there was a gap now, a weak point in the defensive line, and the Japanese were exploiting it. Rivers cleared the jam and resumed firing in under 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds had cost them. Japanese soldiers had made it 2/3 of the way across the sandbar. Some were less than 50 yards away. The Browning swept across them like a scythe, the sustained burst lasting nearly 15 seconds, the barrel glowing dull red in the darkness. Men fell in clusters, but 3 soldiers made it to the riverbank on the marine side, diving into cover behind a fallen palm tree. They were inside the defensive perimeter. They were close enough to throw grenades. Diamond spotted them and opened fire with his carbine, short controlled bursts at the muzzle flashes from behind the log. One of the Japanese soldiers stood to throw a grenade, and Diamond's rounds caught him in the chest, spinning him around. The grenade fell at his feet and detonated, killing him instantly and wounding one of his companions. The third soldier waited, patient, professional, looking for an opening. The ammunition situation was becoming critical. They had burned through half their supply in the first hour. The barrel was overheating, the metal expanding beyond safe tolerances. Rivers called for a barrel change and Diamond moved to execute it, but the procedure required stopping fire for at least a minute. They couldn't afford a minute. Not with Japanese soldiers massing for another push. Not with the eastern sky beginning to show the first faint hint of gray that preceded dawn. The enemy would want to finish this before daylight, before American artillery could properly range them, before air support from Henderson Field could join the fight. Rivers made the decision to keep firing. The barrel would last or it wouldn't. If it warped, they would replace it then. If it failed catastrophically, they would deal with that too. But stopping now meant allowing the Japanese to consolidate their gains, to dig in, to prepare for a final overwhelming assault. Better to risk the weapon than guarantee defeat. The gun continued its mechanical rhythm. Schmid fed the belt, hands moving in the darkness by feel and memory. His fingers found each round, guided it into position, ensured smooth feeding. The brass was hot enough to burn, but he didn't notice. The spent casings piling up around them were ankle-deep now, shifting and clinking with every movement. The sandbags in front of the position had been chewed up by return fire, sand leaking from dozens of small holes. A round had creased Rivers' helmet, leaving a bright scratch across the steel. Diamond's left arm bore a shallow cut from shrapnel, blood soaking through his sleeve, but he hadn't mentioned it and didn't slow down. The Japanese launched another major assault. This one was better coordinated, with covering fire from mortars landing behind the marine positions, trying to suppress reinforcements or prevent retreat. The shells walked up and down the defensive line, erupting in fountains of sand and coral. One landed close enough to shower the machine gun position with debris, peppering them with small stones and fragments of vegetation. Schmid felt something hot graze his neck, a piece of shrapnel or coral. He couldn't tell which. Blood trickled down his collar, warm against his already sweat-soaked skin. The assault wave came fast and focused, concentrating on a narrow front that included their position. Dozens of soldiers, maybe 50 or more, charging in a wedge formation, the point aimed directly at the machine gun nest. Rivers depressed the trigger and held it, the Browning firing one continuous burst, the barrel now glowing bright orange-red, visible even without muzzle flash. The attackers ran into a wall of lead. Men fell in windrows, bodies piling atop bodies, creating impromptu barricades of flesh and bone. But the momentum carried the survivors forward. They reached the 30-yard line, the 20-yard line, close enough to see individual faces, mouths open in battle cries, eyes reflecting muzzle flash, close enough to smell them, that mixture of sweat and gun oil and fear that transcended national identity. Then Rivers jerked backward and collapsed. No dramatic gesture, no shouted words, just a sudden absence of presence. One moment he was there, firing, and the next he was sprawled on his back, a neat hole in his forehead, eyes open and empty. A Japanese sniper somewhere in the treeline, firing blind into the muzzle flash, had made a lucky shot. Or an unlucky one, depending on perspective. Rivers was dead before his brain could process the information. The Browning went silent. Schmid didn't think. There was no time for shock or grief or fear. There was only the tactical reality that the machine gun had stopped firing and the Japanese were still coming, and if someone didn't get that weapon back into action in the next 5 seconds, they would be overrun. He lunged forward, grabbing the grips, swinging the barrel to track the nearest targets. His thumbs found the butterfly trigger. The gun roared back to life. The sensation was different from feeding ammunition. The weapon's recoil transmitted through the grips, vibrating up his arms, demanding constant correction to hold the beaten zone on target. The field of view narrowed to what he could see in muzzle flash, brief illuminated snapshots of the battlefield. Enemy soldiers falling, others advancing, movement at the periphery. He swung the gun left, engaging a group trying to flank from the riverside. Swung right, catching soldiers emerging from behind the fallen palm. Returned to center, hosing down the main approach across the sandbar. Diamond had taken over ammunition feeding without being told, his hands replacing Schmid's on the belt. They worked in silent coordination, two parts of a single organism dedicated to keeping the gun firing. The barrel was beyond overheated now, entering dangerous territory where the metal might warp or even fail entirely. They couldn't stop to change it. There were too many targets, too many threats, too much at stake. A Japanese soldier made it to within 10 yards of the position, close enough that Schmid could see the man's face clearly in the muzzle flash, young and determined and utterly convinced of his righteous cause. The soldier raised a grenade, arm cocked back to throw. Schmid walked the fire across him, rounds stitching a vertical line from groin to throat. The soldier collapsed, the grenade rolling from his dead hand. It lay there for a moment that stretched into eternity, a dark sphere on dark sand, and then it detonated. The blast wave was a physical force that slapped Schmid sideways. He felt it more than heard it, a compression of air and sound that seemed to pause time. Then came pain, immediate and overwhelming, centered on his face. Something wet ran down his cheeks, hot and viscous. His vision went strange, then red, then dark. He tried to open his eyes wider, but nothing changed. The darkness was complete, absolute. He could hear the battle continuing around him, the crack of rifles and the deeper thump of grenades and the screams of wounded men. He could feel the gun in his hands, still vibrating with mechanical life, still firing because his thumbs were still on the trigger. But he couldn't see anything at all. The grenade had been a fragmentation type, designed to maximize shrapnel dispersal. The fragments were tiny, each one no larger than a grain of rice, but traveling at lethal velocity. Several had struck Schmid's face, concentrating around his eyes. The damage was catastrophic. His corneas were shredded. His eyelids were torn. Blood and vitreous fluid leaked from ruptured eyeballs. The pain was extraordinary, but pain was irrelevant. What mattered was that he was blind and the gun was still firing and the Japanese were still coming. Diamond's voice cut through the chaos, close to his ear, shouting to be heard over the weapon's roar. "You're hit. You're hit bad." Schmid's response was instinctive, born of training and stubbornness and a refusal to accept the implications of his condition. "Where are they?" A pause, brief and weighted with terrible understanding. Then Diamond's voice again, steady now, assuming a new role. "Straight ahead. Sandbar. Fire straight." Schmid held the trigger, aiming into the darkness that was now his entire world. He couldn't see the targets, couldn't see the sandbar or the river or the jungle or anything at all. But the gun was a fixed weapon, mounted on a traversing mechanism with a limited arc of fire. He knew the geometry of the position, knew the field of fire, knew that straight ahead meant the primary approach across the sandbar. He fired. Right, swing right. They're coming from the beach. He rotated the gun, feeling the mechanism traverse, counting seconds in his head to estimate angles. The visual landmarks he had relied on were gone. The muzzle flash he had used to illuminate targets was meaningless now. He was operating on memory and trust, trusting Diamond to be his eyes, trusting his own muscle memory to translate instructions into action. There. Hold there. Fire. The gun bucked in his hands. He held the beaten zone, firing sustained bursts into darkness, having no idea if he was hitting anything or simply wasting ammunition into empty jungle. The only feedback was Diamond's voice, urgent and continuous, calling corrections like a forward observer directing artillery. Short bursts. Save ammo. Left now. Left. Schmid adjusted, firing, adjusting again. His face was on fire, the pain intensifying as adrenaline began to wear off. He could feel blood soaking his collar, running down his neck, dripping onto his hands. His eyes felt wrong, like something foreign had invaded them, which was accurate. The grenade fragments were still embedded in the tissue, tiny pieces of metal that his body would spend weeks trying to reject. But all of that was distant, separated from his immediate consciousness by the absolute necessity of continuing to fire. The gun was his purpose. The trigger was his reality. Everything else was secondary. The Japanese kept coming. They had invested too much in this assault to withdraw now. Their doctrine emphasized offensive action, aggressive pursuit of victory, acceptance of casualties as the price of success. They had been promised that Henderson Field would fall, that American defenses were weak, that one determined push would break through. They were wrong, but they wouldn't realize it until the last man fell or the sun came up or ammunition ran out. They charged the machine gun nest again and again, different units rotating in, fresh soldiers replacing the dead, maintaining pressure on a position they correctly identified as critical to the defense. Schmid fired blind. He had never felt more helpless or more purposeful in his life. Every sense except sight sharpened in compensation. He could hear the change in Diamond's breathing when enemy soldiers got close, the slight elevation in pitch that indicated stress. He could feel vibrations through the ground, the thudding of running feet on sand, the impact of bodies falling. He could smell the distinct odor of Japanese gunpowder, subtly different from American ammunition, and use it to judge distance. The machine gun became an extension of his body, or perhaps he became an extension of it. Flesh and metal merged in function if not form. Cease fire. Cease fire. Barrel change. Now. Diamond was taking control, making decisions, assuming command of their two-man crew. The barrel was glowing white-hot now, visible even to the enemy, a beacon marking their position. If they didn't change it immediately, the weapon would fail, and if the weapon failed, the position would be overrun. Schmid's hands left the grips, moving automatically to the barrel change procedure. It was a task they had practiced until it was unconscious reflex. Release the latch. Swing the barrel shroud open. Use the asbestos mitt to grab the hot barrel. Pull it free. Set it aside to cool. Take the fresh barrel from Diamond. Slide it home. Lock the shroud. Close the latch. Return hands to grips. Resume firing. They completed the change in under 40 seconds, working by touch in Schmid's case and dim pre-dawn light in Diamond's. The Japanese used the pause to advance, covering ground while the gun was silent, getting closer than they had before. When Schmid reopened fire, some of the targets were less than 20 yards away. The fresh barrel handled the thermal load better, firing smooth and controlled. Bodies fell. The Japanese advance stalled again. Time became meaningless. Schmid had no way to track its passage. He existed in an eternal present of muzzle, flash thunder and Diamond's shouted directions and the mechanical rhythm of the gun. His hands moved without conscious direction, feeding belts, adjusting aim, clearing the inevitable stoppages that occurred when weapons were pushed beyond their design limits. Blood continued to leak from his eyes, soaking through makeshift bandages Diamond had tied around his head. The pain was a constant presence now, neither increasing nor decreasing, just there, like the humid air or the sound of surf. The ammunition supply was getting low. They were down to their last few cans, maybe 300 or 400 rounds total. Schmid could hear it in Diamond's voice, the stress creeping in, the calculations being made. Every burst now was weighed against future need. Every target engaged meant one less that could be engaged later. If they ran dry before the assault broke, the position would fall. If the position fell, Henderson Field was vulnerable. If Henderson Field fell, the entire Guadalcanal campaign might collapse. All of that weight resting on a blind man's trigger finger and a 19-year-old's ability to call targets in the darkness. But the eastern sky was lightening. Not sunrise yet, but the deep blue that preceded it, enough to see shapes against the horizon. Enough for Diamond to make out individual soldiers instead of just muzzle flashes and movement. Enough to start calling more precise corrections. High! You're shooting high. Drop it down. Schmid adjusted elevation, his hands remembering the mechanical relationship between sight settings and impact point even though he couldn't see the sights anymore. 3 of them. Behind the log. Walk it right. Right more. There. The gun chattered. Diamond confirmed hits. The Japanese were still attacking, but the frequency was decreasing. The waves were smaller now, platoon strength rather than company strength. They were running out of men or ammunition or will or all 3 simultaneously. Their officers kept blowing whistles, kept screaming orders, kept trying to rally troops for one more push, but the enthusiasm was gone. The dawn was coming. American air power would arrive with it. This assault had failed. A final group of soldiers, no more than a dozen, made one last attempt. They came straight at the machine gun position, bayonets fixed, screaming defiance into the growing light. Schmid engaged them at Diamond's direction, the gun tracking smoothly across the sandbar, and they fell one by one, dropping into the sand or the shallow water or collapsing atop bodies already there. The last man made it to within 15 yards before Diamond's carbine fire brought him down. He crawled forward another few feet, still trying, still reaching for the American position with his bayonet extended before him like a talisman. Then he stopped moving. The gun went quiet, not because Schmid released the trigger, but because there were no more targets. The Japanese assault had broken. Survivors were retreating back across the river, dragging wounded when they could, leaving the dead where they fell. The machine gun had fired continuously for over 3 hours. The barrel was ruined, the rifling partially melted, the metal warped from extreme heat. The mechanism was fouled with carbon and brass shavings. The ammunition supply was exhausted, less than 50 rounds remaining in the final belt. But it had held. They had held. Diamond guided Schmid's hands away from the grips. It's over. They're pulling back. You can stop. It's over. Schmid slumped backward against the sandbags, suddenly aware of exhaustion so profound it was nearly hallucinogenic. His hands were shaking, fine tremors he couldn't control. His face felt like someone was holding a blowtorch to it. The blood on his collar had dried, stiff and cracking. He tried to open his eyes again, some part of his brain refusing to accept that vision was gone, but nothing changed. The darkness was complete, permanent. Other Marines were arriving at the position now, drawn by the cease in fire, coming to check on the crew or reinforce if needed. Schmid could hear their voices, shocked and awed, counting the bodies visible in the growing light. Someone said there were over 200 dead Japanese soldiers in front of this one position alone. Someone else was calling for a corpsman, urgent, saying they had men down. Diamond was talking, explaining what happened, his voice flat with exhaustion but steady. Rivers was dead. Schmid was blind. The gun was destroyed, but the line had held. A corpsman arrived, professional hands touching Schmid's face with surprising gentleness, assessing damage, applying real bandages, injecting morphine for the pain. The drug hit his system like warm honey, not eliminating the agony but distancing it, making it someone else's problem. Voices swirled around him, talking about evacuation, about transport to the aid station, about field hospitals and surgery and stateside recovery. All of it seemed abstract, irrelevant. What mattered was that he had kept firing. What mattered was that Rivers hadn't died for nothing. What mattered was that Henderson Field was still in American hands and would launch strikes against Japanese positions before noon. They carried him away from the position on a stretcher, for Marines sharing the load, moving carefully through the defensive perimeter. Schmid tried to memorize the sensation of movement, the angle of the stretcher, the sound of their footsteps, anything to maintain connection with the world he could no longer see. The morphine made everything soft and distant, but underneath it he could feel panic beginning to build, the realization of what had happened, what it meant, what his future looked like now. He forced it down. There would be time for that later. For now, he concentrated on breathing, on staying conscious, on not screaming. The aid station was organized chaos, wounded men everywhere, corpsmen and doctors working with efficient desperation, triaging cases, prioritizing treatment. Schmid was classified as urgent surgical, which meant he jumped the line ahead of men with what the medical staff deemed less critical injuries. A doctor examined his eyes, or what was left of them, and made sounds that communicated more than words. The damage was severe. The prognosis was poor, but they would do what they could. They evacuated him to a field hospital that afternoon, loaded aboard a transport plane along with other critical casualties, flying out over the jungle and ocean, leaving Guadalcanal behind. Schmid barely remembered it. The morphine kept him in a twilight state, aware but disconnected, feeling the vibration of engines and hearing voices but not quite processing either. Someone held his hand during takeoff, another wounded Marine offering silent solidarity. He held on tight. The field hospital had actual surgeons, not just corpsmen with field training. They operated on his eyes twice in the first week, trying to remove the grenade fragments, trying to repair torn tissue, trying to save whatever function might be salvaged. The operations were long and painful even with anesthesia, and the recovery was worse. He lay in a hospital bed with his head completely bandaged, unable to see or speak much because of the swelling, able only to lie there and think. The thinking was the worst part. He had joined the Marines like thousands of other young men in the months after Pearl Harbor, motivated by patriotism and anger and the desire to do something meaningful with his life. He had trained at Paris Island, had learned to shoot and march and follow orders, had bonded with the men in his unit, had deployed to the Pacific full of naive confidence that the war would be hard but righteous and ultimately victorious. Nothing had prepared him for the reality of combat. Nothing had prepared him for the sight of rivers falling. Nothing had prepared him for blindness. The doctors told him, eventually, that his vision was unlikely to return. The damage was too extensive. The fragments had destroyed too much tissue. There were experimental procedures they could try later, stateside, but he should prepare himself for permanent blindness. The words were delivered with professional compassion, but they landed like blows. He was 21 years old and would never see again. They flew him back to the United States 6 weeks later, aboard a hospital ship that took 3 weeks to make the crossing. He spent the voyage in a berth below decks, listening to the sounds of the ship, learning to navigate by memory and touch, beginning the long adaptation to a sightless world. Other wounded men shared their stories, comparing injuries, trading war experiences, building the mythology that survivors create to make sense of trauma. Schmid told them about the machine gun position, about rivers, about firing blind. The story spread through the ship, growing in the telling, acquiring details that may or may not have been accurate. He became a symbol whether he wanted to be or not. The Navy Cross arrived before he did. The award citation described his actions that night in dry military language, noting that Private First Class Albert Schmid had displayed extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, had continued to operate his weapon after sustaining severe wounds that rendered him blind, and had held his position until the enemy assault was broken. It concluded that his actions were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. They pinned the medal on his hospital gown during a ceremony at the Naval Hospital in San Francisco, cameras flashing, reporters asking questions he didn't know how to answer. He couldn't see the medal. He couldn't see the faces of the officers presenting it. He couldn't see anything. The medal was cold metal in his hands, impressive weight but ultimately meaningless. Rivers was still dead. His eyes were still gone. The medal didn't change any of that, but it changed how others saw him. He became a symbol of Marine Corps tenacity, of American determination, of the kind of courage that propaganda posters celebrated. The story was publicized, written up in newspapers, featured in newsreels. Warner Brothers made a movie about it, Pride of the Marines, with John Garfield playing a fictionalized version of Schmid. He consulted on the film, providing technical details, helping them understand the reality of that night, though the Hollywood version inevitably simplified and sanitized what had actually happened. The movie was released in 1945, while the war was still ongoing, intended to boost morale and sell war bonds. It succeeded. Schmid's story became part of the larger narrative of American sacrifice and triumph. The reality was more complicated. The Navy provided medical treatment and rehabilitation, teaching him to navigate without sight, to read Braille, to function in a world that had not been designed with blind people in mind. The training was comprehensive but impersonal, processing him through a system that dealt with thousands of wounded veterans. He learned to recognize people by voice, to move through spaces by memory, to accept help without feeling like he was imposing. It was a new kind of training, as rigorous in its way as boot camp had been, preparing him for a different kind of battle. He married Ruth Hartley in 1945, a woman he had known before the war, who had waited for him despite the injuries, despite the blindness, despite the uncertainty of what kind of life they could build together. The marriage was an act of faith on both sides, a commitment to a future that neither could predict. They moved to Philadelphia, close to where Schmid had grown up, close to family support networks, close to veteran services. They built a life together, day by day, adapting to challenges, celebrating small victories, creating normalcy out of circumstances that were anything but normal. Over the following years, something unexpected happened. His vision partially returned. Not full sight, not the clear, sharp vision of his youth, but enough to perceive light and shadow, to make out shapes and movement, to function with a degree of independence he had thought lost forever. The doctors were surprised. The recovery was gradual and incomplete, limited to peripheral awareness rather than central vision, but it was something. It was enough. He could navigate his neighborhood without assistance. He could recognize his wife's silhouette. He could watch his children play, even if he couldn't see their features clearly. It was a small miracle, medical odds defied by factors no one quite understood. He worked various jobs over the decades, some connected to his veteran status, others entirely unrelated. He raised children, paid mortgages, mowed lawns, attended church, voted in elections, lived the ordinary American life he had fought to preserve. The war became something that had happened to him, not something that defined him, though it was always there in the background, a formative experience that could never be entirely left behind. He attended Marine Corps reunions, reconnecting with men who had survived Guadalcanal, sharing memories with people who understood without needing explanation. Diamond was at some of those reunions, older but recognizable, and they would sit together and remember rivers and the Sandbar and the long night when they had held the line together. The nightmares came and went, more frequent in the early years, less so as time passed. Sometimes he would wake convinced he was back at the gun, that the assault was still ongoing, that he needed to keep firing. Ruth learned to recognize the signs, to wake him gently, to ground him in the present. The psychological wounds proved slower to heal than the physical ones, though the Navy's understanding of such things was limited. Terms like post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist yet. Men were expected to carry their trauma privately, to cope without complaint, to get on with life. Most did, more or less successfully, bearing invisible scars alongside the visible ones. Schmid died in 1982, 40 years after that night on Guadalcanal. He was 61 years old, younger than he should have been, his health compromised by decades of dealing with the lingering effects of his injuries. They buried him with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The Navy Cross displayed on his coffin, Marines in dress blues firing a rifle salute, a bugler playing taps. His family was there, children and grandchildren who knew him primarily as a husband and father and grandfather, only secondarily as a war hero. Veterans who had served with him were there, old men now, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, all of them wearing their service pride quietly.